Hi, Adam.
Hi, Vicky.
Our podcast today is with Adam Waugh. I was introduced to Adam through my sister and brother-in-law, and I know Adam only really as a sailor. He was, I think, their sailing instructor on a sailing course that they had attended at the island of Cumbria, just off the west coast of Scotland. My sister then suggested that Adam get in touch with me with regard to an adventure that he was about to embark on. My business is the Sports Counsel, and I offer sports psychology and counselling services to athletes and sports people. And Adam was introduced to me on the basis that he was about to start on an event called the Mini Globe Race, or rather the Macintyre Mini Globe Race, which was is a solo around the world sailing race, whereby, was it 18 sailors were involved this time, Adam?
There was 15 started.
15 sailors were to circumnavigate the world in a small vessel. And that's the best way of me describing it. I think I'll now ask Adam to introduce himself beyond what I've already said, and also to say a little bit more about the Macintyre Mini Globe Race.
Yeah, thanks, Vicky. Yeah, everything is spot on there. I think just going back to the time when I met your sister and brother-in-law, that was, I think, around about 23, maybe into 2024. The one element that you didn't mention in the intro was the building of the boat. So I decided that rather than buy a pre-built yacht, I was going to build my own boat, and I was in that process of building when I met your sister and brother-in-law, and then got in touch with you towards the middle of 24, which was when I just about finished the build. I was doing the last bits of the build and then starting to prepare for the race itself. So these are 19-foot sailboats, all identical, a single class race, which means that we all have the same boat, the same sails, and therefore, in theory, no advantage or disadvantage to any other sailor. And it was the first time a race had ever been proposed for boats of this size. So if we were to have succeeded, it would have been the smallest boats ever to have sailed around the world. And I guess that was the sort of big deal about it. It was, for me, it was building the boat, and it was trying to do it in a very small vessel.
Excellent. And the process of building the boat itself sounded like it was quite an adventure for you. Would that be true?
Yeah, it absolutely was. I was going into the unknown. I hadn't built anything on this scale before. I was a sort of reasonable DIY, fairly proficient at doing jobs around the house, but this really was taking me into a very new field. So learning lots of new skills, speaking to lots of people, usual sort of thing with a new project. What should take a day was taking a couple of days. So it was a long process and a real race to get things done before the start of the race, hopefully in time for me to be able to do as much sailing on the boat before the race actually happened.
Yeah, and if we think about that, I suppose it kind of leads to one or two of our questions that we'd kind of had a think about before doing our podcast session here. Was that, when we started working together, there would have been a reason for that in your mind, and I suppose one of the questions I would have there would be, what were those reasons, and maybe what were your expectations of working with somebody like myself?
Yeah, that when your name and the concept of talking to a sports psychologist was first mentioned to me, which, as I mentioned, was probably a good 6 to 9 months before we actually spoke. It was almost like I thought, well, maybe that's something that I ought to do. Not that I should really do, but just somebody going into a new race like this, taking me out of my comfort zone. Maybe that's something that I ought to do. As the months went on, as I got closer to the start of the race, and I got more and more muddled, more and more frantic, more and more worried, more and more feeling, will I ever get to the start line? Then I was sort of trying to grab hold of anybody and anything that would keep me calm, keep me safe, keep me on the right tracks. And we're now perhaps 9 months before the start, 6 to 9 months before the start. And when I first spoke to you, I honestly thought it was going to be very much more dealing with sport-related issues in terms of, helping with sleep deprivation. It's a solo race, so there was very limited ability to get any extended sleep. Some physical help, possibly in terms of keeping fit, that sort of angle. So I really was going into the unknown, and it was a very pleasant surprise when we had our first session to realize that the actual scope of what you did was much, much broader than I'd expected and anticipated.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think that sort of sense of, I suppose, uncertainty that you were experiencing, it was only something that you could explain to me. And then also for me to understand what your expectations were was also, something that you had to come to me with. Certainly it's I think always the case for psychology, psychotherapy, counselling, is that we aren't mind readers, and we are there to almost wait and kind of listen to what it is you've got to say. So, even beginning the process, it was very much a case of what is going on for you. And some of the first work that we sort of began with was actually about self-efficacy, and whether or not you felt as though you were ready, competent, confident, all these things that kind of make up your ability to do what's been asked of you. What are your sort of recollections of that? Can you remember much about that?
Yeah, I do, and I think when we started speaking, it was all about me feeling that I had a rightful place around the table with my other fellow sailors. We'd had a few group Zoom calls, and that filled me with a little bit of fear that was I really properly prepared? Was I'd taken up sailing relatively late in life, and perhaps this was all going to be an awful expensive mistake. Having started building the boat in 22, took me year and a half, nearly 2 years to get it launched, and then the start date for the race was getting ever closer. So yeah, when we first started speaking, having the ability and really being almost forced by you to piece together what had happened in the past, what my concerns were at that time, and what else I needed to do to successfully make the start line, was the first time I'd actually sat down with any sort of clarity, taken my head out of the workshop and out of my sail bags and running rigging, and said, okay, I've actually got to sit here and think about what it is and why it is that sometimes I'm waking up feeling I really don't want to be here, and I don't think I'm going to be able to make it.
Yeah, and it's that sort of, it's a classic sort of imposter syndrome thing where you've on the one hand you felt as though you were in good company, in the right company, with sailors who were maybe of a similar level, or maybe some a bit better than you, some maybe less good than you. So you sort of established in your mind where you thought you were in that, and then you were still plagued by kind of uncertainty and issues around the what ifs and the what might happens, and will I be good enough compared to let's say these other people, because ultimately, what you'd entered was a race. And from what I know of you at this point, you're competitive, and that mattered to you.
Yes, I think I had underestimated the race element, and at the stage that we started talking, it was really all about making the start and not tripping up between, over the last few months, and everybody else, seemed to be that much more forward in the process. They seemed to be much more confident. I'm sure they were probably going through exactly what I was going through, but it just didn't seem that way at the time.
Yeah. So we kind of did some work on really straightforward things that you might do in any kind of business environment as well, almost like a SWOT analysis or a kind of sports performance profile, where we looked into just the areas that you felt, you were either competent, confident and settled with, and then trying to expose the ones that were just maybe the ones that were causing the issues, the ones that you thought, oh my goodness, I'm just not ready for that yet. How do I know I'm going to be able to do that? And it was really about trying to, I suppose, literally sort of face up to those challenges and say, well, okay, what do I actually need to practice here? What is it that's needing practiced? What is it that's needing dealt with?
Yeah, I think doing that initial SWOT analysis was very helpful, and it made me focus on what I could realistically do to progress the project and progress my preparedness for the race, and also what was going to be best just to perhaps leave behind at that stage, because I knew whatever happened, if I didn't make the start line, then there was no point in worrying and being concerned about how I'd compete in the race. That came a little later and ended up being a very big part of the 12 months or 13 months that the race took. But up until then, it was get to the start, make sure you're as prepared as you can be. Yeah.
And then if you think about what you that process of getting ready, and you used the word preparedness in there as well, which is a great word to use. If you think about how you might prepare for something now moving forwards, do you think you would do anything differently?
I'd like to think so. And I'm sure, I've done something that I didn't think I'd ever do. So I'm sure it has changed me, and there's definitely evidence that it has. So yeah, I would be able to, or I'd certainly feel a lot more furnished with some of the basics of how to keep yourself in one piece when going into the unknown.
Yeah. And one of the big issues with the unknown is exactly that. It's unknown, it's uncertain. And it's one of the reasons that any of us, just people in general, tend to go into what we would describe as fight or flight mode. And I think that some of the work that we did together was about that, about the fact that there were things that you could plan for, and there were things that you 100% couldn't plan for. And it might be nice for likes of the listeners that maybe tap into this wee podcast to try and get a sense of which bit of your planning was for aspects that you felt were kind of controllable worries, and which bits were uncontrollable and maybe more hypothetical, the ifs and whens and buts.
Yes, and I think it also combined with me being the best version of what I could be, and not trying to just assume I was going to be Superman, and if I wasn't Superman, then that was going to be a disappointment all round. So getting my head around that at the beginning was helpful. I think I with the help of chatting things through with you, it became clear that a lot of the things I was worrying about were completely out of my control. Excuse me. And it took a while for that to sink in, but it did start sinking in, and it did enable me to, if you like, put those things in a box that I might have a wee look into from time to time, but actually there wasn't an awful lot of upside by delving into that in any detail. So things like, how good was I going to be compared to my competitors, really completely unknown. Things like, how fast was my boat going to sail, given that they'd all been built out of boat yards, so there was going to be some minor changes and differences to the shape and speed through the water that all these vessels had. I built the boat at this stage. There was no point in fussing about that. At this stage I was still really very focused on making it to the start line, because that for me was a huge tick in the box, and a huge success for me, because what I didn't want to do was this 2-year project to have not quite made it. And being able to talk things through with you to work out what was in my control, what wasn't in my control, was a great help, particularly in the sort of 3 or 4 months. If you remember, we did quite a lot of work writing stuff down. I ended up we were talking about maybe using a whiteboard. I ended up with a spreadsheet, and I shared it with you quite regularly, and that was also a discipline that was quite good to get into. So just by writing everything down, and it was partly what I wrote down, but very much what I didn't put down, which you knew was an irrelevance at that time, was very helpful.
And I think that when you also go into that phase of you've written something down, immediately there tends to be a sense of accountability, whether that's to yourself or to others. And I know that there were others involved. You had a team. You had your manager. You had your race team that you were developing, and that's very much part of how that accountability then becomes shared. It becomes controlled. It becomes planned, and it just makes it so much easier to contend with.
Yes. For all it was, very much of an amateur event. It was a long event. It was a dangerous event, and therefore we did have to have a lot of people coming along the journey with us, which added to the responsibility. And for me, at the early stage, in fact, all the way through the race, added to some of the stress and feelings of selfishness, feelings of really me being on a jolly and everybody else having to sort of sit at home and bite their fingernails. So there was a lot of that at that early stage, which and a lot of it ran through the race, which is why our contact, which I thought and perhaps you thought might come to an end at the start of the race, but very much carried on during the race.
It's interesting that it's almost as though that and it was quite a common theme. It was like it was almost one of your biggest concerns, that sense of being selfish, and then the sort of associated kind of feelings that you had. I don't want to put feelings and words into your mouth, but just what you felt about that, and that was sort of, it was almost colouring things for you before you went into the race.
Yes, it was. I think with these things, if you feel, or if you convince yourself, or if your loved ones are able to convince you that everything is fine, then your start of every day is that much more positive. If you start the day thinking, well, somebody's suffering at home and I should be there to help, it makes the challenge ahead of you that day really so much more difficult. And as much as I tried, you can't just shut that off. It is a reality, and you have to work out ways of dealing with it.
This is true, very true. And it's not easy in that sense. It's more that it's just a part of the process.
Yes, Yes, completely. And I think what became helpful is that as time went on, you realised that everybody else was in the same boat, and they were all suffering from the same sort of problems and issues.
Yeah, because pretty much everybody's got family, everybody's got friends, everybody's got a team that's involved in the process. And then I suppose with that, by learning about that community, and that's something else we spoke about in terms of your sort of sense of belonging in the community, that then again I'll start the ball rolling. I'll say that community sort of felt like it grew. That was like a growing sense for you. Would that be true?
Yes, it was. So we were sailing around the world. We only hit one continent during our sail, which was, well, I guess Central America we hit, and we also hit South Africa. But other than that, we were just in very small islands, very remote small islands when we did stop. And we stopped maybe 12, 14 times in total. So we were at sea a lot. When we stopped, it was spending a lot of time with our fellow competitors. So we became very close, and we shared a lot of the issues that we were going through. Some cope with the loneliness better than others. Some cope with the sailing better than others. But generally speaking, we all had similar problems, and sharing them with our competitors and what became our very good close friends was very helpful. What I did find is that I was very competitive. I knew I was competitive, but this became a major focus for me. I had a position of lying fifth in the race from very early on, and I was very determined to hold that position. And as the race went on and my competitors got closer for some legs and further away from other legs, it became a really big focus. And I don't think it would have ever been different, because that's just the way I am. But I hadn't appreciated quite how different racing a sailboat is compared to cruising on a sailboat. It's completely different. And you've got to try to put in your mind that every minute of every moment that you're awake on that boat, you're trying to get it to go quicker. If you're not doing something, you're thinking about what you could be doing. So that was a big big challenge that I'm not sure I ever completely conquered, but I had to live with it, and I had to deal with it.
I think it says a lot though about who you are, because you are competitive, and that question of how do you make the boat go faster, in some ways that was almost like it was a mantra, or it was maybe even a motivation for you, and that's one of the things that's important for you, because you had to be motivated for a long time. And I think that the listeners would also sort of be very interested in finding out about, how that maybe waxed and waned throughout the journey and throughout the race itself.
Yeah, it did wax and wane. I think I'm probably proud and stubborn in equal measures. So the idea of failing was something that drove me on, and there was two particular times that I was close to quitting. Not that I was going to stop trying to sail around the world, but I'd had enough of the race. I was concerned about some aspects of what the race organisers were asking us to do. I was inclined to say, well, this is a journey of a lifetime. Why do I have to put myself through this sort of stress in terms of race positions? And I had serious conversations with my land-based team about this, and thankfully they persuaded me not to give up, and we carried on. And it happened twice, and on both times we had proper grown-up conversations about it. But I'm very pleased I didn't give up. I still think if I had, I would have ended up sailing around the world, but I'm very pleased I didn't, because It took me 13 months. It took us all 13 months to get from Antigua back to Antigua again.
Yeah.
And if I hadn't had that race environment, it could have taken me, I'm not saying 13 years, but it would have taken me a lot longer. And whether I would have had a wife when I came back, I doubt. And whether my kids would have thanked me for it, I doubt. So it meant that you had to focus. You had to keep yourself in one piece, your boat in one piece. You had to look after your sails because you knew that, you were fighting to keep that position.
Absolutely. And you tipped on something there that I'm going to ask you just another question about, which was keeping yourself in good shape and keeping yourself healthy and keeping on top of things within the boat. And it's quite an old-fashioned theory. It's got this theory called Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but we seem to keep returning to it when we were doing our sessions together. And although it is a kind of hierarchical process of what physiologically humans need to survive, I've always thought it felt like it should be more cyclical. If one thing drops out, you need to pull another back in. But if you were to describe what that particular kind of theory that we worked a lot on meant to you, how would you describe that to the listeners?
I think it really helped because it's so with Maslow theory in what I was doing, you could almost in every circumstance you could come back to it saying, right, that's what's gone wrong. Whether it's because you didn't have enough sleep, whether it's because you weren't eating, whether it was physical or mental. It was a great base to start off from and to rebase, if you like, and say, okay, don't be irrational about this. You've been at sea for 4 weeks, you're feeling terrible, you're sick of this, that, or the other, but let's just you've got to try and be rational, because what was the case with this particular challenge that I did for all of us is that if something went wrong, there wasn't anybody there to pick up the pieces. So you absolutely had to work out what it was and how to make it better. And when you're tired and when you're, in 35 degrees heat and, you're just struggling, having something to start with, and the triangle for me was a great starting point. Sometimes you're in such a bad sort of mental state, you wouldn't even look at the triangle, but you would always come back to it eventually.
Can imagine,
So really helpful.
And it's just about dealing with the basics. What you need to survive, whether you've got food, whether you've got shelter, whether you're, like you say, well rested or not, and then moving up through that sort of pyramid or triangle, you start thinking about the nicer things. Have you got support from your loved ones? Have you got support from the team in the Mini Globe Race around you, the other competitors? And how do you sort of work through to the process of, well, actually, I could actually make it and complete this, and ultimately that's what it leads you to all the time. When did you think that you were going to complete the race? What was the moment for you? When did that become clear?
It took 13 and a half months. It took 12 and a half months, nearly 13 months. It wasn't until I was almost in sight of Antigua, which would be a day before the finish, that I started feeling, I think I can do this. I relaxed a little bit in the last couple of weeks, and that cost me dearly in terms of, I had a sort of near complete meltdown where I think I got overtired, I got overheated, and I felt very, very unable to cope with anything. That was a very scary moment. The only time I really did feel that I was a bit out of control. So the answer to your question, Vicky, is almost when I could see Antigua.
Antigua.
And days, like a day away from the finish,
Yeah.
because it was just too risky to go there mentally.
Yeah, and I think that was something that we'd spoke about, and sort of maybe on both sides of that, where we'd sort of we'd almost looked at some of the history of other racers who'd gotten to that point where they'd maybe just either been too intensely focused on finishing and racing and not given themselves the appropriate rest, or not fed themselves well and had a complete, meltdown or a breakdown, or just the opposite, just relaxed too much, and forgotten to do the basics, forgotten to do the sort of maintenance on the boat, forgotten to do any of the things that meant that you would get there safely. So all of that was part of the conversation we tended to have, was keep that schedule, keep your daily routine in place. Yes. Right up until you've literally gotten to shore.
Yes. Yeah, and having that structure, it's difficult to keep structure in a day, given that often you have to just react to whatever the weather conditions are. So you can't keep a routine in terms of, at 8 o'clock I'll do this, but you can keep your regular jobs. You can keep, your checklists, and try to bring some form of routine into it, which was very helpful.
And that did include for you things like trying to keep physically fit within the terms of what you could achieve, and you'd had help with that as well. So
yeah, it was a very small space, so I couldn't stand up inside the boat, so the only time you could actually stretch all your limbs was outside, which I tried to do a little bit too much of it crossing the Atlantic first time round, and ended up breaking some ribs. So I was very cautious. Yeah. Ouch. So I was very cautious about that, and ended up losing a lot of muscle tone, a lot of condition. But I'd rather that than break things.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to break things, especially when you're out at sea on your own.
Yeah.
So if we start sort of thinking about, how you came to the end of the race, and how you see yourself kind of almost like relative to your peers now, relative to other sailors, and how you see your performance, how do you see that? What's your perception of yourself now as a sailor?
It's still quite soon after the race. I guess I was living on the boat only 3.5 weeks ago, so I'm still really dealing with all of that at this stage. I think if I did it again, I would approach it in a slightly different way. I guess you might be looking for the answer to that question, Vicky, saying, well, now, of course, I realise that I'm a round-the-world sailor. I've circumnavigated solo. I'm amazing. And
not at all. It's up to you to say what you feel.
It definitely doesn't feel like that. I look at the 4 people that came first, second, third, and fourth, thinking still in awe of them, thinking their skills, their natural talent, their ability to deal with sleep deprivation and different circumstances is great, and I would still like to be better than I am, and I'll continue to do that.
Always aspirational.
Yeah.
I suppose that is what motivates you, though, that sense of wanting to progress, and without that, you wouldn't have done what you actually did.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think if there was a real intrigue and massive sense of adventure, and sense of, if I can do this, it will be the best thing I've ever done, in terms of being able to look back and say, well, that wasn't bad. For my kids to be able to say, well, look what Dad did in his late 50s, early 60s. So that has achieved that big time. In terms of my specific sailing skills, I still think I've got a long way to go.
Yeah, and then it's all relative, isn't it? And I think you've captured it nicely there, in terms of what it means to you to have completed the race. That it sounds like there's part of it is to do with how other people see you, how you kind of value yourself, how other people perceive you. So there's a lot of that tied up in there, and that sense of pride in what you've achieved. It's quite an amazing. Well, it is just an amazing achievement.
Yeah. No, it certainly has. The penny is starting to drop in that respect, and I having gone through what I've gone through, almost the hardest bits make you realise quite how worthwhile it was, because if you can cope with some of that stuff on your own, having to problem solve where there was no options, then it's already starting to give me some confidence in daily life, because there's no point in moaning about not being able to do something here when you've just gone through what you've gone through. It's very true. You just get on with it. Yeah, very true.
And I suppose that kind of captures the sort of idea of resilience and what resilience is. It's something different for everybody, and in your case, it's been partly to do with what you've achieved here. You've kind of pretty much done all of those things by yourself, as you've made it around the world and had to work things out and problem solve things.
I think it's amazing what we're all capable of when we absolutely have to find a solution or find a fix, because there is a few places on the world where there is no other options, and being in the middle of an ocean on a small boat is one of those places, and up a mountain, and there's all sorts of other places on the world as well, but you have to find a fix, because if you can't, same as when I was having the sort of real panic attack just before the end of the race, I remember repeating to myself, you need to sort this out, otherwise something very bad is going to happen. I just kept repeating those words, and you then you get the strength from somewhere. I don't know where it comes from. I got my act together in that instance, and then I slept for longer than I've ever slept on the boat. I think I just completely exhausted myself. I had about 4 hours straight sleep, which is unheard of on a sailboat when you're solo. So it's amazing what you can do if you have to, and you can't put your hand up and say help.
And what you learn from that, it's incredible. We've actually been chatting for almost an hour now, Adam, which feels like it's gone by in a jiffy. I've got a couple of questions just to finish up with. If there was something from the kind of race, it could be one thing, several aspects, what would you say you would hold? I've described it as most dear to you, and what would you go and how would you take that into life moving forwards, and any new adventures you might want to embark on? What's the most?
I would say we need people. We need to look after our friends, and we need to look after the people that help us, because yes, I might have done something amazing, but there's absolutely no way I could have done it without the support of my home team, but also my fellow sailors. We were all helping each other, and these little boats are very basic, but they do go wrong, and without their support, and we were all helping each other, then none of us would have got round. So I would say we're human beings. We're built and invented to be with each other, and to try and keep that at the forefront was what I was doing all the way around.
Oh, that's nice. That's nice to hear. So no man is an island and all that.
Yeah. That would have been a better way of saying it.
I'll say a quick word about your charity. I think it would be worth mentioning your charity, the Ella Dawson Foundation. If you can tell the listeners briefly about that, and then we'll finish up after that.
The Little Wren, which is the name of my boat, the Little Wren Mini Globe Race, was supporting the Ella Dawson Foundation It's a charity that supports young people following a cancer diagnosis. And I know the Dawson family well, who lost their daughter and sister Ella, who's went to Newcastle Uni and lost her battle against cancer in 2021. So very recently, the charity was set up, and they're doing great things. And I got a lot of strength during my race by supporting them and knowing that if I kept going, that we were going to raise more money. We've raised 70,000 so far, and hoping to raise a total of 100,000.
Oh, well, all the best with that. And then of the work that we did together, Adam, is there anything in particular that you feel that we did together that you would sort of take forwards into every day?
Yeah, I think Maslow's triangle is definitely something that even subconsciously I look at. In fact, it is now all subconscious that I look at it, and it's nearly always the bottom one or two lines of the triangle that is where the problem lies. So I would say that, and also just certainly as a sort of 60-year-old man, talking to people and sharing emotions doesn't come naturally. So forcing yourself to do that with a professional like yourself, I found really, really helpful.
Yeah, oh, well, I'm pleased to hear that, and it was an absolute pleasure, and I think it was such a treat for me to work with you, because I don't know anything about sailing, and I think that when these opportunities come up, you have to grab them with both hands. So it's been a delight to work with you. I've thoroughly enjoyed it and really enjoyed watching you succeed.
Great. Thanks, Vicky.